I want to read to you a specimen of her poetry because there she was getting into her 20s and 30s before the Civil War. Her idea was that poetry should serve grand social causes, especially the cause nearest her heart, which was abolition. Remember the first section we had? We were talking about Daniel Webster, who bitterly disappointed Boston's abolitionists by coming out in favor of the Fugitive Slave Act. That really infuriated Anne Whitney when it happened, and she wrote a whole poem about the Fugitive Slave Bill, urging Bostonians to be true to their heritage, oppose Daniel Webster, oppose slavery, and oppose the Fugitive Slave Act. And here's what she said, one of the stanzas in her very long poem, written after 1850 in the Fugitive Slave Act. This is what she said, breathe the breath of freedom's morn, only blast upon your mountain's horn, and let men know where you were born. New Englanders oppose slavery. She was actually quite good, as I said, and her poems were published all over the country in the Atlantic Monthly, for example, after that was founded. So she was making a reputation for herself, but she didn't seem, at least in her own mind, to be able in the long run to make a living as a poet. And she began to wonder what else she could do. Be a school teacher? She tried that for a little while. But then one day, according to the story, she was 27 years old, still writing poetry, still submitting her poems to national publications. And there she was in the greenhouse at her parents' house in Watertown, and she clumsily brushed against a potted plant. Plant falls on the ground, and of course, most of the plant comes out with all the dirt. And according to the story, she sat down and she began playfully molding something out of the dirt. There was now water mixed into it because there was water on the floor. And she actually fashioned an image of a family member. And somebody else in the family said, yeah, that looks just like her. And Whitney decided maybe I could become a sculptor. Maybe that's what I can be. And then she began to think about that more carefully. She took lessons in sculpting by the time the Civil War was beginning, studied anatomy, did what you need to do to become a sculptor, and eventually was making her living that way by the era after the Civil War. By that time, also in the 1860s, Anne Whitney had fallen in love with a woman named Adeline Manning, who we're about to meet, who happened to be a painter. And the two of them had a committed, intimate relationship for the rest of their lives, for over 40 years. And they're buried together, as a matter of fact, under the same stone at Mount Auburn Cemetery in the Manning family plot. It's a very humble stone, but you can go see it if you can find the Manning family plot. So here she is with Adeline. She eventually moved to Italy, which is what you had to do back then, often as an American sculptor, to make a living. And she began to produce sculptures that really fit in with her vision, that an artist got to be a committed social actor as well as simply an artist. This is her rendition of an elderly lady that she called Roma. And the idea, as she and Adeline were living in Rome, was that the city around them had nothing of the great grandeur that had been true of the Roman Republic. It was now sunk into corruption. It was sunk into the spirit of gain and lucre, and too many people were living homeless on the streets. And this is a rendition of Rome the way it had become, a far cry from Rome, of course, during its days of glory. And this is her rendition of Toussaint Louverture, the great Haitian revolutionary who Anne Whitney deeply respected as a fighter for the freedom of African Americans, at least in the West Indies. And she committed this idea really to her artistic sensibility, that what a sculptor had to do was, through her work, through her marble, through her bronze, evince the grand ideals that society ought to be striving for. So just what she tried to do with her poetry, she now tried to do with sculpture. And so it was that she earned a reputation. By the time she was in her 40s, she was quite well known as a sculptor. And so it was that in the 1870s, she got a prize commission when Massachusetts had the chance to submit two sculptures to Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. You'll recall that Breno got one of those commissions, John Winthrop, and she got the other, Samuel Adams. And this is the Samuel Adams that she produced for Statuary Hall in marble. And eventually that went over so well, became so popular, that by 1880, a bronze Samuel Adams was standing down in downtown Boston, where Government Center now is. It's been moved to Faneuil Hall, and that's where you can see it to this day, and that's where the tourists always take pictures of it. I love this statue, and the reason I think this statue in the bronze version that stands in front of Faneuil Hall. It's one of the greatest public monuments in Boston, is that what Anne Whitney decided to do with the social consciousness of hers is depict Samuel Adams at a certain vastly important moment in time. So where this statue is in front of Faneuil Hall is significant because the date that this statue memorializes is March 6th, 1770. It's the day after the Boston Massacre. A huge town meeting had just been held in Faneuil Hall. 3,000 people attending it, bursting Faneuil Hall to the seams. There are plenty of people outside trying to listen in. And what that meeting decided was that the troops had to be removed from Boston and had to be removed right away. Armed with that determination of the town meeting, that evening, Samuel Adams walked away from Faneuil Hall, went through snow still stained with the blood of the victims of the massacre, walked into the old State House, walked up the stairs to where acting Governor Hutchinson was awaiting word of the town meeting. And there was Hutchinson, flanked by the finery of royal officials on either side, awaiting what the town meeting had decided. There were the portraits of kings in back of Hutchinson, James II, and I think King William was there too. And up strides Samuel Adams. What Hutchinson had said earlier was that he might remove one regiment, but he didn't think he had any power to remove the other one. There were 2 regiments in Boston. But this is what Samuel Adams said. He wasn't afraid. He looked right at Hutchinson, and this is what he's doing here. This is what he said. If you can withdraw one regiment, you can withdraw both. It's at your peril if you do not. On you alone rests the responsibility of the decision. Our committee has discharged its duty, and now it's up to you to discharge yours. Night is approaching. An immediate answer is required. And then he crossed his arms, just like he's doing there. And I love this because that's the moment where truth has just spoken to power, where Samuel Adams in the town of Boston were now awaiting the response of power, officialdom. This is what we think. What are you going to do about it? In that one moment, I think Whitney captures not just that famous moment in Boston's history as Adams confronted Hutchinson, but also the entire spirit of the revolution. All the petitions, all the marching, all the crowds, all the speeches, all the letters, all of it, essentially in their own way, an attempt to secure justice in the face of power. And that's what Samuel Adams is doing there. And he still speaks truth to power to this day. Because there he is at Faneuil Hall, looking across Congress Street to Government Center, where the city of Boston, of course, has its headquarters. And it's a wonderful thread of Boston history. It's a moment precious to all of us as Bostonians. And Whitney captures that defiance, that almost Old Testament prophet-like defiance. This is Hosea, this is Jeremiah, speaking truth to power. And there he is, and there I hope he always remains. Now, I know what you're thinking in looking at the statue. Of course, you're all thinking this. What is a woman doing sculpting a man's legs? So awful. How dare Anne Whitney, who after all was a woman, sculpt a man's legs? Well, you're not thinking that because this is 2025, and that probably never occurred to you. But back in the 1870s, it did occur to some Bostonians, much to the despair of Anne Whitney. There's another view, kind of a dramatic one, of Samuel Adams. And the reason those legs are important is that just about the time she was putting the finishing touches to the Samuel Adams statue, a committee of leading Bostonians decided that Boston needed a statue of Charles Sumner, who had died, I think, in 1875, not that long before Adams went up. And they decided to have a competition where leading sculptors could submit their designs. And this was close to Anne Whitney's heart. She really wanted this commission. Sumner was an abolitionist. She deeply respected Sumner. Sumner was one of her heroes. She wanted this commission that would fit in with her social justice mission as a sculptor. And she knew what Sumner looked like seated. The commission was supposed to be for seated Sumner. That was the original idea of the Sumner Statue Committee as they began to raise the money. Well, this is what Sumner looked like when he was seated. That's Sumner's great friend, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, right next to him. And so she decided to give us a seated Sumner. And that's pretty good, a seated Sumner. And it was so good that the committee looked at it and decided that should win the design. that should be the one we should put up in the public garden. Until somebody on the committee looked a bit more closely on the application and found out that this person was actually a woman who had submitted this design. And somebody on that committee, the story goes, apparently decided that it would be unchaste for a woman to actually sculpt a man's legs. And maybe she wouldn't be much good at it. After all, she's a woman. What does she know about man's legs? And so because of that, apparently, according to some art historians, she didn't get the commission. She wasn't awarded it. And she couldn't believe it. She was absolutely beside herself with rage at this. But she told her brother in a letter, I'm not going to let some Boston committee quench my spirit. I can get over this. But you can imagine her disappointment. And I think all of us should be disappointed at this, that the small-minded Boston committee would not give her the commission for the Sumner statue. Instead, it went to Thomas Fall, and we'll talk more about him in another session. Now, there were some women who got very good commissions around Boston at the time. After all, Whitney herself did Samuel Adams. What could this committee have been worried about? But that's Emma Stebbins, another fine sculptor, and she gave us the Horace Mann statue at the State House. But of course, look, this nice toga. And we don't have to worry about that. She doesn't have to know about man's legs because she could just put somebody in toga. So they weren't too surprised at that. Go ahead, Emma Stebbins. But when it came to trousers, what people were actually wearing in the 1870s, that was a different story. She didn't get the commission. And this is Thomas Fall's Charles Sumner, which is a bit of a wooden, I think, composition, a bit lifeless, a bit prosaic, not too much special about it. And nobody has had very many kind words to say about that, but I'm sure all of you have seen that on the public garden. And you probably also know that Whitney would get, in a way, the last laugh because her seated Sumner, a version of what I just showed you, would eventually be installed at Harvard Square. And since the early 20th century, it's been there. You can always see it in traffic going down Mass Avenue. The students pass by it all the time. So at least it's on public view, but not in the public garden. Now, speaking of Anne Whitney, that brings us to the statue that I wanted to bring up today. She wasn't done with Boston Public Commissions. Her grandest effort, I think, is probably the Adams statue in front of Faneuil Hall. But she has another one that everybody knows about, behind which there's a pretty good story that has to do with that guy. And now that guy is Evan Norton Horsford, who I bet some of you have heard of. He was a chemist for Harvard University for many years. His great claim to fame is that it was Evan Horsford who came up with a way to combine the ingredients of baking powder into one convenient package so that people could buy it and very easily create bread without using yeast. Here are the ingredients that he combined in one package for a usable, marketable baking powder that would revolutionize kitchens all over North America. Anybody know the ingredients? Early, we have some chemists. Well, obviously the ingredients are sodium bicarbonate, monocalcium phosphate, and cornstarch. And you add a little water to that, and you've got baking powder, and you don't have to go through all the different steps. Otherwise, you'd need to leaven bread and do the baking you want to do. And so this is what he began to market, Rumford baking powder. So you probably all heard of Rumford baking powder, because he was the Rumford professor of chemistry at Harvard. So he named it after that. That's the Rumford baking powder. Now, he did all sorts of things beside that. He made a fortune off this. He manufactured that in East Providence, Rhode Island for many years. But he also invented a usable kind of condensed milk. And that patent he sold to the Borden Company. The rest is history, condensed milk. He also came up with a very convenient, transportable, and very simple kind of daily ration for the Union Army in the Civil War, consisting of a little bit of beef and a little bit of vegetable extract. And that didn't make much of a difference because they only began to distribute that towards the end of the war. But I kind of think it deserves to be thought of as the first genuine packaged rations in American military history. So he did a lot of wonderful things, made a great deal of money, and by the time he was still relatively young, he was able to retire, not going to do any more teaching, and he was just going to leave his business enterprises to others. And then he was able to pursue the great passion of his life. And the great passion of his life was to demonstrate that Leif Erikson and the Vikings had settled Middlesex County. that they have not simply limited themselves, as many thought, to Newfoundland and areas like that they had voyaged up the Charles River, and they had established their capital at, of course, Anne Whitney's Watertown, Massachusetts. And that was, according to him, at least the site of ancient Norumbega, a word that used to appear on the older maps that the Puritans had. For a while, Evan Horsford would trudge through the fields in the forests of the Charles River Valley, and every time he saw a little stone with a strange mark on it, he would say, "That's a rune. Vikings have been here and left a rune." And he would take friends on a tour of a grassy space of land by Memorial Drive, not far from the Charles River. And there he would point out a barely perceptible little height in the ground. And he would say that was Leif Erikson's longhouse. That's where he lived. And if you saw a little depression, a little pool right by the longhouse, he would say that's where they would catch the fish. They would have these special wares, and they'd get in the pools, they would get the fish that way. He didn't see anything in those woods that failed to remind him of the Vikings who surely settled this area and made it their capital. The fact that hardly anybody else believed this didn't really matter to Evan Horsford. He had the money, he financed the research, he did the publications, and what he really wanted, finally, was, you guessed it, a statue of Leif Erikson, the man who he believed was the genuine founder of New England. And by now, it was the late 1880s when he began thinking of a statue. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow actually supported him on this, so he wasn't completely alone. At just the time he's thinking about this statue, everybody was about to commemorate 1892, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. And there were plenty of people, as some historians have pointed out, that liked the idea of a Nordic discoverer of America and not a Southern Italian like Columbus. God forbid one of them should have discovered America. It's got to have been a Northern European, maybe not quite an Englishman, but the next best thing, maybe somebody from Norway, for example. And so why not put up a statue of Leif Erikson? Because it's almost 1892. And that's why Evan Horsford had support in commissioning a statue of Leif Erikson. And the person he wanted to do it was Anne Whitney. And she was eager to do it. And you might be wondering why. Because she was a believer in social justice. She had nothing against immigration, for example, nothing against Southern Europeans. But the reason she decided to do it was she was actually friends with Evan Horsford. Among many other things, Evan Horsford had given money to Wellesley College. He deserves to be thought of as the chief funder of its library. In the early days of Wellesley College, he endowed traveling professorships so that Wellesley faculty members could go to Europe and study and research, maybe do a little teaching. He was a great supporter of women's education, just as Anne Whitney was, and a great supporter of Wellesley. They knew each other, and that's why Anne Whitney took the commission. She got to work, and she was all ready by 1887 to have this statue of hers dedicated. The fundraising was chiefly done by Horsford. He had plenty of money. But by this time, by the 1880s, plenty of Scandinavian fraternal organizations around Boston, groups of people of Swedish and Norwegian and Danish heritage, were also eager to see this done, and they began to contribute money. So in no time at all, the money was raised, and Anne Whitney did the statue. And there it is. You've all seen the statue of Leif Erikson. You can't miss it. Right now, it's on Charlesgate. Always looking as if he's wondering if the Red Sox traffic is out yet. But it was originally on Mass Ave. Mass Ave and Commonwealth Ave was the original point where this was. Looking at Anne Whitney's work, you might wonder what's going on there. This doesn't seem to be a good way to dress for the North Atlantic. But to be fair, Anne Whitney wanted to portray him on dry land. So he's not supposed to be in a ship here. He's supposed to be on dry land, looking towards the west, having landed in North America, maybe a little bit before the action in the statue. And according to Anne Whitney, what's really going on here is that this is a representative of the old world, which she called the purblind old world, gazing into the glare, gazing into the sunny promise of the new world. So that's what he's supposed to be doing symbolically in the statue. When that was unveiled, however, one person actually blurted out, "Did the Vikings wear tights? What's going on here?" Because those legs aren't quite bare, but they kind of look like bare legs. And there's always been a school of thought that this was, in a way, an inside joke by Anne Whitney. You guys don't think I can sculpt male legs? Look at these. Look at these. They're pretty convincing. Not too bad. And that could be, we have no real way of knowing. But all we know is this is her last major Boston commission, Leif Erikson. I kind of like it, as many people do. Beyond the question about, why would there be a Leif Erikson statue in Boston? I think there's a certain grace about it, a lightness about it that is compelling and is very different from any other Leif Erikson statue. Leif Erikson statues were about to go up all over the country in the 1890s into the 20th century. There's one of, oh no. Why is Betty Davis on that screen? I meant to mention this. I'm going to talk about this in a future session. This is something to look forward to. But there was a rumor going around Boston at one point that somewhere in Boston, there's a statue modeled after Betty Davis. And some people thought maybe it's Leif Erikson here. Maybe that was modeled after Betty Davis, forgetting the inconvenient fact that Anne Whitney had designed this before Betty Davis was born. But we'll get back to Betty Davis, because the mystery of Betty Davis, in a way, I think it's not much of a mystery, but I want to talk about that a little bit later on. So we'll leave that aside for a second. Difficult to leave Betty Davis aside, but we will. Now there's another Leif. Look how different these other Leif Eriksons are. These are real berserker Vikings in other parts of the country. There's another Leif Erikson, very different from Anne Whitney's. There's another Leif Erikson, and that's usually how they tend to be around the country. But Anne Whitney gives us this Leif Erikson, which many people kind of gawk at and wonder about. But once you know the story, it makes a lot of sense. And it certainly was very popular among the Scandinavian Americans who were living around Boston. At the time of the dedication, this was in 1887, they came out in droves to celebrate Leif Erikson being commemorated this way. They're very proud of Leif Erikson. The Norwegian Society banners were everywhere at the dedication ceremony. 200 members of the Scandinavian Society were there. The Icelandic flag was waving in the air. 400 members of the Swedish American Society came to the dedication. The Denmark Society was there, 300 of them. The largest procession of Scandinavian Bostonians the city had ever seen gathered that October day to welcome Leif Erikson to the Back Bay. And so it remains there to this day. Anne Whitney would live, I think, another 25 years or so. She died at the age of 93. And the headline of the Boston Globe was "World's Oldest Living Sculptor Dies." I'm not sure she really was, but that's what the Globe said. And she is well regarded today as one of the most consequential American sculptors of the late 19th century. And it's just a shame that she was treated so badly by that Sumner Committee back in the 1870s. Now, we're going to leave Anne Whitney aside, but I did want to suggest something about the Leif Erikson statue. What does it mean to us today? And I think it can still have special meaning to anybody of Scandinavian descent. Leif Erikson didn't actually go to Boston. We know that. But he did come to the New World. That may be something to be proud of. I don't see much wrong with celebrating Leif Erikson as a voyager, for example. But I think probably it has a special significance to all of us in that it doesn't just celebrate Leif Erikson, the explorer, it also celebrates Evan Horsford. And I think it commemorates that strain of eccentric New Englander. You get a little bit of money and maybe you spend it in silly ways. And there's a certain eccentricity that is celebrated in Boston, celebrated in New England. And I think the statue kind of celebrates that. It could be a little in-joke by Anne Whitney, but it's certainly something that if it reminds us of Evan Horsford in the single-minded quest of his, maybe something that brings a smile to our face. And for that reason, I think it commemorates not just Leif, but also something distinct to the New England character. In other words, I think it's time to turn over a new Leif. And speaking of eccentricity, a lot of you have probably seen this. That's the Gravity Monument at Tufts University. And that was left there by Roger Babson, who funded the creation of Babson College, not too far away from here. He suffered tragedies in his life. His sister drowned in the Annisquam River. His grandson also drowned in the effort to save somebody else in danger of drowning. Roger Babson decided, therefore, to devote some of his considerable fortune to funding a foundation that would investigate gravity, how gravity worked, and maybe find a way to conquer gravity, so that, in his own language at least, maybe you wouldn't actually need a propellant to fly. If you actually mastered gravity, you could send a plane right up there, would never have to come down. And this is a monument. The Gravity Research Foundation is what he founded. And this is a monument that you can find in several universities around the country, including Emory, but this one happens to be at Tufts. And that's what I mean by a certain eccentricity in the New England character. Probably you can't actually conquer gravity in any meaningful way. Gravity, although weak in a way, because look what I can do. I can totally jump. And the earth is supposed to be holding me down, but I can jump. But it's also the force that wins in the end. Gravity always wins in the end, as we know. But the idea of trying to master it, rather an eccentric idea, is something that's good to remember. It's something that's good to associate with Roger Babson, and that's his monument at Tufts. And to this day, at Tufts, if you get a doctorate in physics, what they do is they bring you over to the Tufts monument, the gravity monument, and they have you kneel and they drop an apple on your head. Stephen Hawking won an award with the Gravity Research Foundation, so it's a serious thing. It actually does fund good gravitational research, a very valuable thing to this day. And now we move on to our second monument. This is somebody who we might not know very well, but I hope to introduce you to her in case you haven't heard of her. We're about to talk about the monument that is especially precious to the Polish American community of Boston. And speaking of Polish Americans who lived in Boston, this is Dr. Maria Elizabeta Zakarewska. And most people just called her Dr. Zach. That's how she went by. She came to America from Berlin, where her Polish family was living at the time, at the age of 23, because she wanted to be a doctor. This is before the Civil War. Entering the medical profession would have been difficult for her in Prussia, but she thought she might be able to do that in America. So she came here, and she found that things were pretty difficult here as well. She was able to enroll, however, at medical school at Case Western in Cleveland. They actually let her in, but fellow members of her boarding house gave her the cold shoulder. Faculty members were hostile to her. They couldn't quite kick her out, but they didn't welcome her either. And when she finally got her degree, Case Western would not admit another woman for 25 years. She did begin practicing medicine with her mentor, her heroine, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, in New York City. It was not free of controversy. At one time, a crowd hostile to what they feared might be going on at that office actually assaulted her office in Greenwich Village with pickaxes and tried to invade the building, only driven away, luckily, at the last moment by police. Only in Boston did Dr. Zakarewska, come into her own. And it was there, in Boston, July 1st, 1862, that Dr. Zach founded the New England Hospital for Women and Children, only the second hospital in America to be operated by women for the primary benefit of women. And it's still there to this day. It's the Dimmock Community Health Center in Roxbury. And the oldest building in that facility at the Dimmock Community Health Center is still called the Z Building, named after Dr. Zakarewska. This happened to be this really important hospital. This happened to be the first hospital to employ a female surgeon, the first hospital to offer a nursing school in America, and the very first one to graduate an African-American nurse, Dorchester's Mary Eliza Mahoney. It was such a success that Dr. Zach and Dr. Blackwell actually managed to raise $50,000 because what they wanted to do was give it to Harvard Medical School on the condition that Harvard Medical School start admitting women and giving them scholarships. $50,000. Who could refuse that? Harvard Medical School could refuse that. There was a near rebellion on the faculty. They didn't want women at Harvard Medical School. They wouldn't take the gift. So where was the $50,000 going to go? Dr. Blackwell, Dr. Zakarewska decided, let's give it to Johns Hopkins. And Johns Hopkins Medical School began admitting women in 1893 because of that gift. She served the women and children of Roxbury in Greater Boston with energy with kindness and with skill throughout her professional life. Marie Elizabeta Zambrezka. But that wasn't the only reason she's important to Boston, because one thing she remembered about Berlin, where she had grown up, was that there were these big piles that the authorities used to put in residential neighborhoods for the kids to play in. They would get in these piles of sand, and they would creatively make things out of the sand and wallow in the sand, and they had fun. And Dr. Zabreska said, if that can work in Berlin, why not Boston? And she got the city of Boston to donate a little bit of land in the North End for a sand pile. And sure enough, the children of immigrants in the North End really enjoyed playing in the sand piles. And by the time the Leigh Barrettson statue went up, by the end of the 1880s, there were 10 of these sand piles all over Boston where kids could play. And eventually they became known as playgrounds. And she, Dr. Zabreska, is the true founder in America of the playground movement, which in a way is going on to this day. By the time she died in Jamaica Plain in 1902, they were all over the country. There were over 1,000 playgrounds by the time she died. So this was a consequential, important person, Dr. Zabreska. So you all join me in assuming that during the 1920s, when the Polish-American community of Boston wanted to erect a statue to a Polish American of great significance, that she would be the first thing that anybody would think of. Not quite. So when they decided to erect the statue, they decided they were going to erect it of somebody else. And one reason was, not that, one reason was that this is the 1920s. And in the 1920s, there were still very few statues in America of actual women. Monumental statues of women. If you saw a statue of a woman, it was probably symbolic or allegorical. This is Thomas Crawford's famous Statue of Freedom that's on top of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. So you can see an allegorical woman. Statue of Liberty is a good example in New York Harbor. The very first portrait statue of an actual woman erected in the United States didn't happen until the 1870s. Maybe they should have waited a little longer. Because when Hannah Duston was somebody who murdered in their sleep 10 Abenaki Indians, which is why she was celebrated in New England in the late 19th century. But here she is, she's got a tomahawk in her right hand, a skull in her left hand, an Indian skull. It is still there. It's still outside of Concord, and there's a copy of it, I think without the skull, I may be wrong, outside of Haverhill. In Haverhill, Massachusetts. And that was the very first one, the very first statue of a woman. The very first statue of an actual historical woman in New York City, does anybody know? It's been there since 1915. You go way uptown towards Columbia, you'll see Joan of Arc by Anna Hyatt Huntington. So Joan of Arc has been leading imaginary Frenchmen into battle since 1915 in Upper Manhattan. And you can see for yourself that when women were actual historical women, when they were memorialized back then, they were exhibiting what we might call male masculine virtues, or as they saw it, Hannah Duston, Joan of Arc. So the idea of Maria Elizabeta Zambrezka having a statue, a healer, a woman of charity, would have been unusual even in the 1920s. So maybe it's not surprising that the Polish community of Boston, when they began raising money, decided that they wanted to commemorate somebody else, somebody very different. A Pole, a very important Pole, but not Zambrezka, but rather Tadeusz Kosciuszko. So here he is, the great Tadeusz Kosciuszko, pronounced Kosciuszko, although I've seen it pronounced other ways as well. Kosciuszko, right? Kosciuszko. Well, so here he is. And so that statue was commissioned ultimately to mid to late 1920s. I think it went up in 1927, if I recall. But the most important thing about this, to me, is what it can mean to us today. I'll get to that a little bit later. The nature of the statue and also the person who did it, because the person who did it was one of the finest sculptors working in the Boston area at the time. And there she is, Brookline's own Theo Ruggles Kitson. Oh, yeah. This is the way she looked early in life. She got the Kosciuszko Commission when she was in her 50s. working at her house in Framingham. She had a big barn outside of her house where her studio was, and that's where she would eventually give us the Kosciuszko statue. That's where she fashioned it. Kitson is a really important sculptor in the history of public monuments in New England. She became an adult after deciding to become a sculptor in the 1890s. And at that time, a lot of the Civil War monuments that you would see looked like this familiar one here. You've all seen these kinds of monuments. They would feature a rather inert design, a Civil War soldier often at parade rest, like you see here. And there'd be a certain stagnancy about it. There's no movement about it at all. They're literally at parade rest. And that made some sense after 1865 when people were grieving. And the idea of a soldier eternally at parade rest, like this one, was a moving idea and was acceptable to a lot of people. But they all seemed to be like that for a while. And Theo Kitson was among those who thought sculpture, in order to stand the test of time, should have more liveliness about it, should be more animated, should be something that would repay repeated viewing. So she began to design, which her professional career began, Civil War monuments that did have animation and did have motion to them, like this one in Topsfield. You can see the huge difference between that. Somebody was just taking up a banner after the banner bearer had been shot by a Confederate bullet, and that one. So she was a generation of sculptors that brought a new liveliness to these compositions in memorializing the fallen world of the Civil War. She is best known, however, for this design, which is pixelated to the extent that maybe it doesn't come across very well. But you have all seen this design by hers. She was given a commission to design a statue of a Spanish-American War soldier. And this happened right after the war ended, right after 1898. And the design she came up with, she called the hiker, because soldiers of that generation in the Philippines, in Cuba, were called hikers. And her design has a soldier of the Spanish-American War holding a Krag-Jurgensen rifle. Many sculptors appreciate this design. It's hard to tell, but the musculature of the arms is just what they should be. Somebody holding something of the weight of the Krag-Jurgensen rifle. It's actually quite well done. And it met with such popular satisfaction that 50 copies of the hiker were made and distributed all over the country, making a good bit of change for Theo Kitson. And the one that's close by us is in Cambridge. You've probably all seen that, I think, off of Garden Street in Cambridge. There's a copy of the hiker. But you can't go very far in America without running into a copy of Theo Kitson's hiker. So that's how she did very well for herself as a sculptor. She and her husband, Henry Hudson Kitson, were a married duo of sculptors, and they did over 100 different works at Vicksburg National Military Park. So if you ever get down to Vicksburg, that is almost a monument to the Kitsons. Henry Hudson and Theo, much of the work is theirs. So she was extremely well known by the first part of the 20th century. So it's not surprising that she got the commission, and this is what she produced. This is Tadeusz Kosciuszko, as you see him today in the public garden. And the first thing to be said about him before we go any further is that there is a certain movement about him. You can see that he's walking outside, that his coat is being blown in the wind. He's out looking at the fortifications that he was in the process of designing for West Point in the Hudson River Valley. Fortifications that were so formidable that the British never even considered assaulting West Point during the Revolution. Instead, they tried to take it by stealth, corrupting Benedict Arnold, whose plot was discovered just in time to prevent the disaster of West Point falling into the hands of the British. So the composition to me is a naturalistic, compelling composition of Tadeusz Kosciuszko, the way he would have looked as he was going about his finest services on behalf of the American cause during the Revolution. So to understand that a little bit, I just wanted to tell you something about what he did. And then we can get to what I think is the modern significance of this sculpture. He really was the hero of two worlds. He really was important to the American cause. And here's why. The year is 1776. Kosciuszko, a Pole, had just been thwarted in a love affair. He wanted to marry a woman he deeply loved. He was prevented from doing so. He took her handkerchief, he put it next to his heart, and he carried it there for the rest of his days until he died in 1817. What can you do for us? Asked General Washington. Try me, answered Kosciuszko. I'm ready to do anything. Luckily for the cause of independence, Kosciuszko. By the way, George Washington spelled his name 11 different ways in his correspondence. And one way George Washington spelled it was Kaleski. Where did they get Kaleski out of Kosciuszko? At any rate, George Washington soon began to depend on him. He was an eager volunteer, and luckily he studied engineering. He studied engineering back in Europe. He demonstrated engineering knowledge greater than many Americans had at the time. And so he was put to work. And West Point was not just the most famous and most important of his works. He did design most of the fortifications there. He also did this. In 1777, there he was in General Gates's Northern Army as Burgoyne's British were going down the Great Lakes, threatening Albany, threatening to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, maybe an early end to the Revolution. And it was Kosciuszko who hit upon the idea of felling trees in front of the British and putting them across the road where the British had to march in a way that the branches of the trees were all entangled with one another. So the British couldn't easily move them out of the way. And as a result of that, it took the weary redcoats on this march 3 weeks to get from Lake George to the area around a little bit north of Albany. And once they got there, it was Kosciuszko who picked the place where General Gates dug in at Bemis Heights, and the rest is history. That won the Battle of Saratoga, which helped secure the French alliance, which helped win the revolution. But he wasn't done. Kosciuszko's most important contribution to the cause came a couple years later, after West Point. In 1781, he was down south with General Greene's Southern Army. As General Greene's army was retreating desperately in the face of General Cornwallis's pursuing redcoats, it was Kosciuszko who dashed ahead to the Dan River and began putting together a fleet of boats that would take General Greene across, leaving Cornwallis frustrated, unable to get any way to cross the Dan River, preserving Greene's army to fight another day, which they did, causing ultimately Cornwallis to make the dread decision to march to Yorktown in defeat. So the two great American victories of the war, Saratoga and Yorktown, both stem directly from Kosciuszko's interventions. He deserves commemoration, and he deserves to be remembered for those reasons, certainly, and for many others. Here are the Kosciuszko statues. Notice how different they are. This Kosciuszko statue is in Krakow in Poland. There's a copy of it in Detroit, because many American cities have their own Kosciuszko statues funded by Polish American communities there. This happens to be one of them, but that's the Kosciuszko the way he would have been fighting against the Russians after the revolution, when he went back to Poland and conducted his hopeless crusade for Polish independence. And here's another one. This is the Grand Kosciuszko. You'll see that in Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C. But I think Theo Kitsen's Kosciuszko is more approachable and I think a more of an inviting statue. And the reason I like it is it commemorates his actual American service as an engineer, as somebody who did the less heralded work that ultimately wins campaigns and wins revolutions. Maybe not a moment of outright courage on horseback facing musket fire, but the slow, plodding work of making sure the trees are felled, making sure the fortifications are where they should be, making sure the boats were built. It was those services that helped to win the revolution more than anything else. And that's why Kitsen shows Kosciuszko with the plans for West Point in his right arm, right there. So wonderful composition and wonderful statue. But for us, I think it has a special meaning. For many years after it was dedicated, Polish Americans, many of them from the Polish Triangle in Dorchester, near the corner of Columbia and Dorchester Avenue, would come to the statue. They would lay wreaths. They would celebrate Polish independence. And especially during the Solidarity movement, they would come to show support for Lech Walesa at the statue from time to time. So it really was for most of its history, a focal point for Polish-American pride. That's where the money had come from at first. And the people who celebrated that statue when it was dedicated were largely Polish-Americans. Here it is, October 16, 1927. Polish-Americans by the trainload came to Boston to help dedicate this statue from as far away as Maine. Many dressed in the colorfully embroidered costumes of their native land. After arriving at South Station, many of these New England Poles, 15,000 of them, formed a parade that made its way finally down Beacon Street towards the Public Garden, featuring 50 bands, 50 floats, each depicting some aspect of Poland, past and present. Red and white Polish flags flapped proudly in the breeze, and hundreds of children, Polish-American children, having walked all the way from the Polish Triangle, all the way from Dorchester, marched down Beacon Street in the form of a great Christian cross. It could have been, probably was a beautiful sight. There were 100,000 onlookers at the dedication, many of them Polish-Americans, who were delighted to see the statue. No one had expected such an enormous turnout, but there it was. And the only negative thoughts for the entire day were in the heads of the Art Commission, because the Art Commission members were there. They were the ones who chose Theo Kitson. They really thought highly of her for the commission. And there they are watching the dedication, but they had a kind of a low feeling in their stomachs because the Park Commission had made a mistake, and they put Kosciuszko on this side of Charles Sumner instead of that side. It's actually in the wrong place. And now it was too late to move it. So they were a little bit upset about that. But other than that, for everybody, it was a very good, positive day. And that's the way the statue was always regarded. Something of particular interest and importance to Polish Americans. And as a matter of fact, there's a little box containing earth from Krakow underneath the pedestal of the statue, which will be there for all time. But I think there's something else about this, a story that some of you know, that to me commends this statue to all of us well beyond the Polish American community. And that story has to do with him. Has anybody ever heard of Agrippa Hall? Agrippa Hall had been born in Northampton, a free African-American man, moved to Stockbridge when he was relatively young, and that's where he was when the revolution began. He then, after the fighting started, joined Washington's army, and he met Kosciuszko that way. Eventually, he became Agrippa Hall, the orderly of General Kosciuszko, and they fought all the way through the revolution together. They became fast, close friends. They deeply admired each other. Agrippa Hall was one of these guys who could do anything. You give him a task that had to be done, he'd figure out how to do it. He was an invaluable orderly and very resourceful. They were together when Kosciuszko was helping to save General Greene's army in North Carolina, and they were together a little bit later on in South Carolina. I did want to point out that one thing none of these statues do is commemorate Kosciuszko getting wounded, because he was wounded by a British bayonet in the buttocks. And none of them show that for some reason. But one of the ones who cared for him after he was hurt was Agrippa Hall. And at the end of the revolution, they corresponded, they stayed friends. Agrippa Hall went back to Stockbridge. Kosciuszko went back to Poland, where he was engaged in what captured the imagination of the rest of the world, the historic fight for Polish freedom. A fight that was hopeless at the time, but that he carried on with courage and with great dedication. And when he was captured by the Russians, this is what one poet said: "Hope for the season bade the world farewell. Freedom shrieked as Kosciuszko fell." Kosciuszko never forgot about Agrippa Hall. And in 1798, Kosciuszko came back to America after he was released by the Russians. And they met again, and they talked about old times. And it was that year, in 1798, that Kosciuszko sat down with his friend Thomas Jefferson. And Kosciuszko worked out a will, a last will and testament with Jefferson. Jefferson was going to be the executor. And this is what the will said. I was a general in the army. I've got back pay coming to me. over $15,000 in back pay, because Congress owes me that. Congress has given me 500 acres of land on the Scioto River out in Ohio, close to where Columbus is today. All that is now in my possession, but I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm not going to claim the back pay. I'm not going to sell that land out in Ohio. I'm not going to live there. I'm going to go back to Europe. But this is what he told Jefferson. They wrote this out. When I die, you, Jefferson, I want you to sell that land, collect the back pay, however much it is, and I want you to use that to buy the freedom of enslaved people. Enslaved people that you know of and your own slaves. I want you to buy them out into freedom with all that money that will come from the land in the back pay. And he signed it to Kosciuszko. And Jefferson was supposed to be the executor. And in just 1 month before Kosciuszko died, he fell from his horse and died that way in 1817. Just 1 month before he died, he wrote Jefferson. And he said, don't forget that will. Don't forget this is what you need to do for me. But then Kosciuszko died. Jefferson was in his 70s. He dragged his feet. He never executed the will. He was worried that there were other wills that Kosciuszko had entered into. There were 4 other wills. And like you said, how could you enforce this one if there are these other later wills that Kosciuszko has entered into? It was possible, testamentary intent was there, at least, because Kosciuszko had that letter he wrote to Jefferson. But nevertheless, there's a big split in the historical community. Should Jefferson have tried this? Should he have tried to get that money and bought some of those human beings out of slavery? Could he have shown that moral courage? Could that have been an example for others? Could history have changed? We'll never know, because nobody was ever bought out of freedom with the money. Other executors would take care of what was in the estate. They'd lose a good bit of that money. And eventually, there was a Supreme Court decision all the way up in 1850, a Supreme Court decision about this, that resulted in none of that money being used to free anybody. So the testamentary disposition went to naught. But maybe not completely, because to me, today, when we walk down the public garden and we see that great hero, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who really did contribute immeasurably to victory in the revolution, we shouldn't just remember that. And we shouldn't just think about his Polish ancestry and what was important to people in the 1920s when they contributed money for this statue. We should think about one thing, perhaps, that was in the minds of those people in the 1920s. Why was it so important to Polish Bostonians to have a statue like this? It was the 1920s. There was anti-immigration sentiment all over America in the 1920s. They wanted people to know their contribution. They wanted people to know that they had helped build the country like so many others. And what the statue can remind us of today are 2 really important things. One, that sometimes it does take immigrants like Kosciuszko to remind us to live up to those ideals that we hold precious. Samuel Adams speaks truth to power, demands that we remember those ideals, and so does Kosciuszko. An immigrant who fought for freedom and who wanted to free others when so many Americans did not. And who better than an immigrant to make us stand up and live up to what should be our ideals? This is what you profess. This is what you want to do. I think the statue ought to remind us of that. And the statue can also remind us of Agrippa Hall and their friendship, a Black man and a Polish crusading knight, if you will, almost, who came from Poland to America to fight for freedom. A friendship that would give rise to that will, and a friendship that in itself, it was full of potential then as now, of what the country could be, what the country should be. So we don't have to be of Polish ancestry. We don't even have to be experts on the revolution. Maybe we just need to remember Agrippa Hall in the will and whatever aspect of Tadeusz Kosciuszko that helps us lead a happy, fulfilling, productive life today. And that's what monuments can do. Remind us of things that we may forget, but that we should know. Speaking of Kosciuszko, there are many places named after Kosciuszko all over the country. They don't all spell it the same way. This is Kosciuszko, Mississippi. Who was from Kosciuszko, Mississippi? Oprah Winfrey. This is Oprah Winfrey's hometown, Kosciuszko, Mississippi. This is Mount Kosciuszko, the tallest point in Australia. It's named after a Pole, Kosciuszko, because the man who first climbed it was a Pole in 1840, and he thought it should be named after Kosciuszko, and so it's named after Kosciuszko. And if you go exploring the mountain, you'll see these teeny little wildflowers, Kosciuszko wildflowers. They don't grow anywhere else in Australia but around those slopes. So they're endangered, but they're being taken care of, but maybe they should be okay. But the worst part of Kosciuszko is Kosciuszko Circle. So all of you, if you drive around Boston, you'll know this, sometimes known as the Devil's Rotary. And it's a shame to me that if anybody knows Kosciuszko around Boston, often they don't know the statue, and they don't know Agrippa Hall, and they don't know about the will. But they do know about the daily process of taking your life into your hands when you approach the Kosciuszko Circle. The state is rectifying it now. It's not the way it was, but for a while, that was the most dangerous real estate in all of Boston, Kosciuszko Circle.
Where is it?
It's right by where the old Boston Globe building was, Morrissey Boulevard, down in Dorchester. That's where it was. But let us resolve to remember Kosciuszko, Agrippa Hall in the will, and hopefully not that. And I think that's why I'm excited about this book I'm trying to finish, because I want people to know these stories. I think it enriches our lives when you know about Agrippa Hall and the services of Kosciuszko. So, looks like that's all for now. It's been an hour. So thank you very much.